The Mystery of Times Square. The black and white image, dated August 14, 1945, captured the jubilant celebration in Times Square following Japan's surrender announcement. What had started as a routine archival cataloging project at the Metropolitan Museum of Art had suddenly become something far more intriguing. "Margaret, come look at this," Sarah called to her research assistant, who was busy organizing a stack of wartime photographs nearby. Margaret Williams, a graduate student in art history, approached with curiosity. "What is it, Dr. Chen?" Sarah pointed to a specific section of the photograph. "See these two children here, standing near the Paramount Theater? They appear to be twins, identical clothing, same height, similar facial features. But look closer." Margaret squinted at the image, then reached for the magnifying glass. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. "There's a third figure." Indeed, between the two children, who appeared to be twins, there was a shadowy outline of what seemed to be another child. The figure was translucent, almost ghostly, as if caught between dimensions. Unlike the sharp, clear images of the twins, this third figure appeared blurred and ethereal. This photograph came from the estate of Robert Kellerman, a war correspondent who documented the end of World War II, Sarah explained, consulting her notes. According to the documentation, he took this shot at approximately 7:15 p.m. But there's no mention of any photographic anomalies or special effects. Margaret studied the image more intently. Could it be a double exposure? Maybe someone moved during the shot? "That's what I initially thought," Sarah replied. "But look at the positioning. The twins are perfectly still, and their shadows fall naturally. This third figure, it's almost as if it exists in a different plane entirely." The photograph measured 8 by 10 inches and bore the distinctive grain of the twins, who appeared to be around 8 or 9 years old, wore matching sailor suits, a popular children's fashion of the era. The boy stood on the left, the girl on the right, both smiling broadly at the camera. Between them, the mysterious third figure seemed to mirror their pose, but remained frustratingly indistinct. Are you fascinated by historical mysteries? Subscribe to our newsletter for weekly stories about unexplained phenomena from the past. Sarah has spent the better part of her career studying photographic anomalies from the 20th century, but this image presented unique challenges. The technical quality of the photograph was exceptional for its time, suggesting that Kellerman was a skilled photographer with access to high-quality equipment. This made the presence of the anomalous figure even more puzzling. "I think we need to bring in some experts," Sarah decided. "This could be significant, not just as a historical curiosity, but potentially as evidence of something we don't yet understand." Margaret nodded enthusiastically. "Who should we contact first?" "Let's start with Dr. James Morrison at Columbia. He's one of the leading experts in photographic analysis and historical documentation. If anyone can help us understand what we're looking at, it's him." As Sarah reached for her phone, she couldn't shake the feeling that this photograph held secrets that went far beyond a simple double exposure or camera malfunction. The timing, Video Day, one of the most emotionally charged moments in American history, seemed too significant to be coincidental. The afternoon sun streamed through the museum's tall windows, casting long shadows across the research room. In that light, the mysterious third figure in the photograph seemed to shimmer slightly, as if responding to the changing illumination. Sarah made a mental note to examine the image under different lighting conditions. "There's something else," Margaret said, still studying the photograph. "Look at the expressions on the twins' faces. They're not just smiling for the camera. They're looking at something specific, and their gaze seems to be directed toward where this third figure would be standing." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. If Margaret was right, it suggested that the twins could see something that the camera barely captured, something that existed in that moment, but perhaps not in the same way as everything else in the frame. "We need to find out who these children were," Sarah said with growing determination. If they're still alive, they might be able to tell us what really happened that day. 3 days later, Dr. James Morrison arrived at the Metropolitan Museum, carrying a briefcase filled with specialized equipment. A tall, distinguished man in his 60s, with silver hair and keen blue eyes, Morrison had spent decades analyzing historical photographs for authenticity and anomalies. His reputation in the field was unmatched. "Sarah, it's good to see you again," he said warmly as they shook hands. Margaret described this photograph as unprecedented in her email. "That's quite a claim. Wait until you see it," Sarah replied, leading him to the research room where the photograph was now displayed under professional lighting. "We've been careful not to handle it too much, but we've made several high-resolution scans for analysis." Morrison set down his briefcase and approached the photograph with the careful reverence of someone who understood the fragility of historical artifacts. He studied it for several minutes without speaking, occasionally adjusting the angle of the light or moving closer to examine specific details. "Remarkable," he finally murmured. "The clarity of the twins is exceptional, but this third figure..." He trailed off, reaching for a specialized magnifying device from his briefcase. "What's your initial assessment?" Sarah asked. Morrison continued his examination before responding. "Well, I can tell you what it's not. This isn't a double exposure. The grain pattern is consistent throughout the image. It's not a reflection or lens flare. The positioning is wrong for that. And it's definitely not a later edition or manipulation. The photographic paper and chemicals are authentic to..." Margaret leaned forward eagerly. "So what could it be?" "That's where things become interesting," Morrison said, setting up a digital microscope connected to his laptop. "Let me examine the molecular structure of the image in that specific area." For the next hour, Morrison conducted a thorough technical analysis. He measured light refraction, analyzed grain patterns, and used spectral imaging to examine different layers of the photograph. Sarah and Margaret watched in fascination as various details became visible under different types of light. "The results are unusual," Morrison announced, reviewing the data on his laptop screen. "The area where the third figure appears shows a different density of silver halide crystals, the compounds that created the image on film. It's as if something was there, but not quite in the same way as the other subjects." Subscribe now to get exclusive access to expert analysis of historical mysteries and unexplained phenomena. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "What does that mean exactly?" "In simple terms, it suggests that something was present during the exposure that interacted with the film differently than normal light reflection. The twins in the background show standard photographic properties. Light bounced off them and was captured by the camera in the expected way. But this third figure..." Morrison is clearly struggling with the implications of his findings. "It's almost as if it was there but not entirely solid." Margaret suggested. "That's not scientifically impossible," Morrison admitted reluctantly. "There are documented cases of photographs capturing things that weren't visible to the naked eye at the time. Usually, it's explained by differences in light spectrum sensitivity between human vision and photographic film." Sarah studied the data on Morrison's lap. "But you don't think that's what happened here?" "No, I don't," Morrison said firmly. "The spectral analysis shows that this figure appears across multiple light frequencies. Whatever caused this image, it was interacting with light in ways that we don't fully understand." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Morrison, a man of science who had debunked countless photographic mysteries over his career, was essentially saying that this image defied conventional explanation. "There's something else," Morrison continued, pulling up another set of data. "He analyzed the positioning and proportions of the third figure. Based on the perspective and scale, it would have been standing in exactly the same spot as one of the twins, specifically the girl on the right." Margaret gasped. "You mean they're occupying the same space?" "According to the photographic evidence, yes. But that's physically impossible under normal circumstances." Sarah stared at the photograph with new understanding. Unless they weren't normal circumstances. Morrison packed up his equipment slowly, clearly troubled by his finding. Sarah, I've been doing this for 30 years. I've seen every type of photographic anomaly you can imagine. But this is something entirely different. I'd like to bring in some colleagues, if you don't mind. We need more opinions on this. Of course, Sarah agreed. Who did you have in mind? Dr. Elena Vasquez from MIT. She specializes in quantum photography and light behavior. And Professor William Hartley from Oxford is an expert in historical documentation and wartime photography. If anyone can help us understand this, it's them. As Morrison prepared to leave, it turned back to Sarah and Margaret. I have to ask, have you experienced anything unusual while working with this photograph? Any sensations or feelings that seemed out of the ordinary? Sarah and Margaret exchanged glances. Why do you ask? Sarah replied, because in my experience, photographs that capture unexplained phenomena sometimes have residual effects. People who work with them closely often report strange experience. Margaret nodded slowly. Actually, yes. Sometimes when I'm looking at it, I feel like someone's watching me. And yesterday, I could have sworn I heard children laughing in the research room. But when I looked around, no one was there. Morrison's expression grew serious. Document everything, every sensation, every unusual occurrence. If this photograph is what I think it might be, those experiences could be important evidence. Want to learn more about unexplained photographic phenomena? Join our community of mystery enthusiasts and researchers. While waiting for Morrison's colleagues to arrive, Sarah decided to pursue another line of investigation, finding the twins themselves. If they were still alive, they would be in their 80s now, but their testimony could provide crucial insights into what happened that day in Times Square. Sarah began her search in the museum's archives, looking for any additional information about photographer Robert Kellerman and his work during VJ Day. She discovered that Kellerman had been a meticulous record keeper, maintaining detailed logs of his assignments and the people he photographed. In a dusty file box marked Kellerman Personal Effects, Sarah found a leather-bound journal filled with the photographer's handwritten notes. The entry for August 14 photographed numerous families and individuals celebrating the end of the war. Notable subjects include the Hartwell twins, Thomas and Elizabeth. Children were visiting from Albany with their grandmother, Mrs. Dorothy Hartwell. Unusual lighting conditions during their portrait seemed to shimmer around the children. May have been reflection from nearby neon signs. Hartwell twins, Sarah murmured, making notes. Thomas and Elizabeth. From Albany. Margaret looked up from her own research. That's a good lead. Albany's not that far. If they stayed in the area, there might be records. Sarah spent the next several hours combing through online databases, genealogical records, and newspaper archives. The search was challenging. Hartwell was a common surname, and records from the 1980s were often incomplete. But gradually a picture began to emerge. She found a 1926 Albany newspaper article about the local family's war celebration, which mentioned Thomas and Elizabeth Hartwell, children of the late Captain Robert Hartwell, who had died in the Pacific Theater. They were living with their grandmother Dorothy Hartwell on Madison Avenue in Albany. Further searching revealed that Dorothy Hartwell had died in Thomas had become a teacher and moved to Vermont, while Elizabeth had married and settled in Connecticut. Most importantly, both appeared to still be alive. I found them, Sarah announced triumphantly. Thomas Hartwell, now 87, lives in Burlington, Vermont. Elizabeth Hartwell, Morrison. She married a Morrison. No relation to Dr. Morrison. Lives in Hartford, Connecticut. She's 87 as well, obviously. Margaret grinned. Are you going to contact them? I think we should visit them in person, Sarah decided. This is too important for a phone call. Besides, seeing the photograph might trigger memories that they wouldn't recall otherwise. Sarah arranged to take a few days off from the museum and planned a road trip to visit both twins. She decided to start with Thomas in Vermont, as Burlington was closer to New York City. The drive to Berlin took about 5 hours, giving Sarah time to think about how to approach the conversation. How do you ask someone about a potentially supernatural experience from over 70 years ago? How do you show them a photograph that might challenge everything they believe about reality? Thomas Hartwell lived in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of Burlington, surrounded by maple trees that were just beginning to show their fall colors. When Sarah knocked on the door, she was greeted by a tall, thin man with white hair and bright blue eyes that seemed remarkably youthful for his age. "Mr. Hartwell, I'm Dr. Sarah Chen from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I called yesterday about a photograph from..." Thomas's face lit up with curiosity. Yes. Come in. I have to admit, I've been thinking about that day ever since you called. It's not often someone asks about your day after all these years." Sarah followed him into a comfortable living room filled with books and family photographs. She noticed several pictures of Thomas with what appeared to be his sister Elizabeth at various stages of their lives. "Mr. Hartwell, before I show you the photograph, I'd like you to tell me what you remember about that day in Times Square. Take your time." Thomas settled into his favorite chair and closed his eyes, clearly concentrating. "It was the most exciting day of my life up to that point. Elizabeth and I were staying with our grandmother in Albany, and when the news came that Japan had surrendered, she decided we simply had to go to New York City to be part of the celebration." He paused, a smile crossing his face. The train was packed with people, everyone singing and laughing. When we got to Times Square, it was like nothing I'd ever seen. Thousands of people, confetti falling like snow, sailors kissing girls, everyone hugging strangers. "Do you remember having your picture taken?" Sarah asked. "Oh yes, there was a photographer, a nice man with a big camera. He said he was documenting the celebration for posterity. Elizabeth and I were so excited to be photographed by a real professional." Sarah leaned forward. "Do you remember anything unusual about that moment? Anything that seemed strange or out of the ordinary?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his expression growing thoughtful. "You know, there was something, Elizabeth and I both felt it. It was like someone else was there with us. Someone we couldn't quite see, but we could sense their presence." Sarah's heart began to race. "Can you describe this feeling?" "It was warm and comforting, like having a friend nearby." Elizabeth said later that she thought it might have been our father. He had died in the war, you know. We both had the strongest feeling that he was there, watching us celebrate the end of the war he had died fighting. Discover more incredible stories of wartime mysteries and unexplained phenomena. Subscribe to our premium content for in-depth investigation. Sarah carefully removed the photograph from her briefcase. "Mr. Hartwell, I'd like you to look at this and tell me what you see." Thomas put on his reading glasses and studied the image. His face went pale, and his hands began to tremble slightly. "My God," he whispered, "there he is." "Who?" Sarah asked gently. "Our brother," Thomas said, his voice filled with emotion. "Our brother, Michael." Sarah felt the world shift around her. "Mr. Hartwell, I thought you and Elizabeth were twins." Thomas looked up at her with tears in his eyes. "We were triplets. Michael died of pneumonia when we were 6 years old. But Elizabeth and I always felt like he was still with us, especially during important moments." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. The mysterious third figure wasn't a stranger or a photographic anomaly. It was the spirit of a deceased triplet, somehow captured on film during one of the most emotionally charged moments in American history. "He's really there, isn't he?" Thomas asked, studying the photograph more closely. "After all these years, here's proof that we weren't imagining things." Sarah nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Mr. Hartwell, would you be willing to speak with my colleagues about this? And would you help me contact your sister Elizabeth?" "Of course," Thomas said immediately. "Elizabeth needs to see this. She's going to be amazed." 2 days later, Sarah found herself sitting in Elizabeth Morrison's sunny kitchen in Hartford, Connecticut. Elizabeth was a petite woman with silver hair and the same bright blue eyes as her brother. Unlike Thomas, who had seemed immediately accepting of the photograph's implications, Elizabeth appeared more skeptical. "I appreciate you making the trip, Dr. Chen," Elizabeth had said, pouring tea into delicate china cups. "Thomas called me yesterday, quite excited about your visit, but I have to say, I'm not sure what to make of all this." Sarah had learned from her experience with Thomas to approach the subject carefully. "Mrs. Morrison, your brother mentioned that you were triplets originally. Can you tell me about Michael?" Elizabeth's expression softened immediately. "Michael was the youngest of us by about 10 minutes. He was always the most sensitive, the most intuitive. When he got sick," she paused, collecting herself. "It was nena contra 42. Antibiotics weren't widely available yet. He fought for 3 weeks, but his little body just couldn't overcome the infection." "How did his death affect you and Thomas?" "We were devastated, of course, but children are resilient. What was strange was that we continued to feel his presence, not in a frightening way. It was comforting. We would play games and automatically set out 3 portions, or save a seat for him. Our grandmother thought we were just having trouble accepting his death." Sarah nodded understandingly. "But you felt it was more than that?" "Thomas and I both did. We could sense when Michael was with us. It usually happened during important moments, birthdays, holidays, the first day of school. We developed a kind of code between us. If one of us felt Michael's presence, we would touch our left ear. The other would know immediately." Elizabeth stood up and walked to a window overlooking her garden. "The day in Times Square was one of the strongest times we ever felt him. The celebration, the joy, the sense that the world was finally safe again. It was exactly the kind of moment Michael would have wanted to share with us." "Mrs. Morrison, I'd like to show you the photograph now." Elizabeth returned to the table and put on her reading glasses. Sarah placed the photograph in front of her and watched as Elizabeth's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, recognition, and finally, a kind of peaceful acceptance. "There he is," she said softly, touching the image gently. "My little brother, Michael." Unlike Thomas, Elizabeth didn't seem shocked by the revelation. Instead, she appeared almost relieved. "You know," she continued, "I've been waiting 78 years for proof that what Thomas and I experienced was real. People always said we were just grieving children with overactive imaginations. But we knew better." Sarah leaned forward. "Can you tell me more about that day? What do you remember about the moment this photograph was taken?" Elizabeth studied the image more closely. "I remember the photographer was very kind. He asked us to stand close together and smile. But just before he took the picture, Thomas and I both felt Michael join us. I touched my ear. You can see it in the photograph if you look closely," and Thomas nodded. "We both knew Michael was there." Sarah examined that photograph again and indeed could see Elizabeth's left hand raised toward her ear in a subtle gesture. The photographer seemed to sense something too. Elizabeth continued. "It took several shots, but he kept looking puzzled, as if his camera was showing him something he didn't expect. After he finished, he asked us if we had a brother or sister with us. When we told him about Michael, he got very quiet." "What did he say?" "He said that sometimes cameras could see things that eyes couldn't. He told us to never doubt what we felt, because love was stronger than death." Elizabeth reached across the table and took Sarah's hand. "Dr. Chen, I've lived through a world war, raised 4 children, buried a husband, and seen technologies that would have seemed like magic when I was young. But this photograph, this is the most important thing that's ever happened to me." Subscribe to our newsletter for more incredible true stories that challenge our understanding of reality. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just a historical curiosity anymore. It was proof of something that had sustained 2 people through nearly 8 decades of life. "Mrs. Morrison, would you be willing to participate in a more formal investigation? We have experts who would like to study this phenomenon more thoroughly." "Of course," Elizabeth replied immediately. But I have one condition. What's that? I want to be there when you publish your findings. Thomas and I have kept this secret for most of our lives, because we were afraid people would think we were crazy. If this photograph can help other people understand that love transcends death, then it needs to be shared with the world. That evening, Sarah called Thomas to update him on her conversation with Elizabeth. The siblings had already spoken, and both were eager to participate in whatever research would follow. Chin, Thomas said over the phone, Elizabeth and I have been talking, and we want you to know something. We're not afraid of skeptics or scientists who might try to debunk this. We've lived with the truth for 78 years. We know what we experienced, and now we have proof. Now you feel that way, Sarah replied, because I think this story is going to attract a lot of attention. Good, Thomas said firmly. It's time the world knew that some things are more powerful than death. Elena Vasquez arrived from MIT on a crisp October morning, bringing with her equipment that looked more suited to a space mission than a museum. A quantum physicist in her 40s with an infectious enthusiasm for unexplained phenomena. She had spent years studying the intersection of consciousness and quantum mechanics. Sarah, this is fascinating, she said, examining the high-resolution scans of the photograph on multiple monitors. I've seen quantum effects captured in laboratory conditions, but never in a historical photograph taken under natural circumstances. Professor William Hartley from Oxford had arrived the day before, and the three experts now formed an unlikely team in the museum's research room. Hartley, a distinguished historian in his 70s, brought a different perspective to the investigation. From a historical standpoint, Hartley explained, their Day represents one of the most emotionally charged moments in modern history. The collective relief, joy and grief of an entire nation was focused into a single moment. If consciousness can affect physical reality, and there's growing evidence that it can, then Times Square on August 14, 1945 would have been a perfect storm of psychic energy. Vasquez nodded enthusiastically. That aligns with quantum field theory. Consciousness appears to be a fundamental force in the universe, capable of influencing matter at the subatomic level. In moments of extreme emotional intensity, these effects might become visible to sensitive instruments like photographic film. Sarah watched the two scientists discuss theories that would have seemed like science fiction just decades earlier. So you're saying that the twins' grief and love for their deceased brother, combined with the emotional intensity of Day, somehow made Michael visible to the camera? It's a working hypothesis, Dr. Vasquez replied, but we need more data to support it. Over the next week, the team conducted extensive tests. They analyzed the photograph using techniques that hadn't existed in 1945. Electron microscopy, spectral analysis, quantum field measurement, and even attempts to detect residual electromagnetic signatures. The results were unprecedented. The area of the photograph containing Michael's image showed quantum field fluctuations that were still detectable 78 years later. The silver halide crystals in that specific region exhibited properties that defied conventional physics. It's as if the photograph is a window into a quantum event that occurred in 1945, Dr. Vasquez explained to the team. The emotional energy of that moment created a brief intersection between dimensions, and the camera captured it. Professor Hartley had been researching similar cases throughout history. I found 17 other photographs from emotionally significant historical moments that show similar anomalies. The assassination of President Kennedy, the liberation of concentration camps, the first moon landing, all have produced images with unexplained figures or phenomena. Margaret, who had been documenting every aspect of the investigation, looked up from her notes. Are you saying this isn't unique? The phenomenon isn't unique, Hartley clarified, but the clarity and verifiability of this particular case is extraordinary. Most similar photographs are dismissed as hoaxes or camera malfunctions. But we have the original subjects alive to testify. The technical documentation and now scientific evidence. Join our exclusive research community to get early access to groundbreaking discoveries about consciousness and reality. Morrison, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, finally spoke up. We need to consider the implications of what we're discovering. If consciousness can influence physical reality to this extent, it changes everything we think we know about death, memory, and the nature of existence itself. Sarah felt the weight of that statement. What do you think we should do with this information? We publish, Vasquez said immediately. The scientific community needs to see this evidence. It could revolutionize our understanding of consciousness and quantum mechanics. Professor Hartley agreed. From a historical perspective, this photograph represents a unique intersection of human emotion and physical reality. It deserves to be studied and preserved. But Dr. Morrison looked troubled. We need to be careful about how we present this. The scientific community can be very skeptical of anything that challenges established paradigms. We need irrefutable evidence and multiple independent confirmations. Sarah thought about Thomas and Elizabeth, both eager to share their story with the world. The twins want this published. They've waited their entire lives for validation of their experience. Then we do it right, Dr. Vasquez decided. We prepare a comprehensive paper with all our findings, submit it to peer review, and let the scientific process work. But we also document the astronomy story, the twins' testimony, the historical context, the emotional significance. Over the following month, the team worked tirelessly to prepare their findings. They conducted additional interviews with Thomas and Elizabeth, researched similar cases throughout history, and performed every scientific test they could think of. The twins visited the museum several times, each time providing new details about their experience. They brought family photographs, letters from their grandmother, and even Michael's birth certificate and death certificate, providing completed documentation of the triplets' existence. You know, Elizabeth said during one visit, Thomas and I have been thinking about why this photograph surfaced now, after all these years. What do you mean? Sarah asked. We're both in our 80s, Thomas explained. We won't be around much longer to tell this story. Maybe the photograph was meant to be discovered now, while we're still here, to provide context and testimony. The thought sent chills down Sarah's spine. The timing did seem remarkably coincidental. Or perhaps, as the twins suggested, it was something more than coincidence. As the team prepared to publish their findings, an unexpected discovery changed everything. Margaret, who had been digitizing Robert Kellerman's entire photographic archive, found something that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. Dr. Chen, you need to see this, Margaret called excitedly from across the research room. Sarah hurried over to find Margaret staring at her computer screen, which displayed another photograph from Kellerman's VGI Day collection. This image, taken approximately 30 minutes before the famous shot of the twins, showed a wider view of Times Square. Look at the timestamp, Margaret said, pointing to Kellerman's handwritten notation on the back of the photograph. 6:45 p.m. 30 minutes before the twins' portrait. Sarah studied the image carefully. It showed the same area of Times Square, with hundreds of people celebrating in the streets. But there, near the spot where the twins would later stand, was a clear, unmistakable figure of a young boy. That's Michael, Sarah breathed. But this was taken before the twins arrived. Margaret nodded excitedly. And look at this. She pulled up another photograph, this one taken an hour after the twins' portrait. 8:15 p.m. An hour later, in this third photograph, the same ghostly figure of Michael appeared again, this time near the statue of Father Duffy, several blocks away from where the twins had been photographed. He was there all day, Sarah realized. Michael wasn't just appearing in response to his siblings' presence. He was part of the celebration itself. Dr. Vasquez, who had been called over to examine the new evidence, was speechless for several minutes. "This changes everything," she finally said. "We're not just looking at a localized quantum event triggered by the twins' emotions. We're seeing evidence of a consciousness that was independently present and mobile throughout the celebration." Professor Hartley examined the photographs with growing amazement. "In all my research into historical anomalies, I've never seen anything like this. We have documented evidence of a deceased individual participating in a historical event." The team immediately contacted Thomas and Elizabeth to share the new discovery. Both siblings were overjoyed, but not entirely surprised. "Michael always loved celebrations," Elizabeth said over the phone. "Of course I would have wanted to be part of your day, even if he couldn't be there physically." Thomas added, "We always felt that Michael was more present during happy occasions. This just proves that he was enjoying the celebration as much as everyone else." Don't miss our upcoming documentary about this incredible discovery. Subscribe now for exclusive behind-the-scenes content. The additional photographs provided the final piece of evidence the team needed to support their conclusion. They now had proof that consciousness could not only survive death, but could also interact with the physical world in measurable ways. Dr. Vasquez spent weeks analyzing the quantum signatures in all three photographs. "The energy patterns are consistent across all three images," she reported. "We're seeing the same consciousness manifesting in different locations over a period of several hours. This suggests that what we call death might simply be a transition to a different state of existence." The implications were staggering. If consciousness could survive death and interact with the physical world, it would revolutionize not just science, but philosophy, religion, and humanity's understanding of its place in the universe. Sarah found herself thinking about all the people throughout history who had reported encounters with deceased loved ones, only to be dismissed as delusion or grief-stricken. How many of these experiences might have been real? "We're going to face enormous skepticism," Morrison warned it during one of their planning sessions. "The scientific establishment isn't going to accept this easily. Then we make the evidence so compelling that they can't ignore it," Dr. Vasquez replied. "We document everything, submit to peer review, and invite independent verification." Professor Hartley had been working on the historical context of their discovery. "I've found similar reports from other significant historical moments," he announced. "Gettysburg, the sinking of the Titanic, the London Blitz, all have documented cases of unexplained figures appearing in photographs or being witnessed by multiple people. Are you suggesting that major historical events create conditions that allow the deceased to manifest?" Sarah asked. "I'm suggesting that consciousness might be more fundamental to reality than we've ever imagined," Hartley replied, "and that moments of intense collective emotion might create windows between dimensions." As the team prepared their final report, Sarah reflected on how much her understanding of reality had changed since that first day when she noticed the mysterious figure in the photograph. She had started as a skeptical academic, but the evidence had gradually convinced her that the universe was far stranger and more wonderful than she had ever imagined. The twins, now in their late 80s, had become the team's most enthusiastic support. They visited the museum regularly, sharing stories about Michael and their lifelong awareness of his continued presence. "You know," Thomas said during one visit, "Elizabeth and I aren't afraid of dying anymore. This photograph has shown us that death isn't an ending, it's just a different way of being." Elizabeth nodded in agreement. "We've always known Michael was still with us. Now the whole world will know it too." 6 months after the initial discovery, the team's findings were published simultaneously in the Journal of Quantum Physics, the Historical Photography Review, and the International Journal of Consciousness Studies. The response was immediate and intense. Within hours of publication, the story had been picked up by major news outlets around the world. The photograph of the twins with their deceased brother became one of the most analyzed images in history, sparking debates in scientific communities, religious organizations, and philosophical circles. Dr. Sarah Chen found herself at the center of a media storm. Interview requests poured from television networks, documentary filmmakers, and journalists from around the globe. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, initially concerned about the controversial nature of the research, soon found itself hosting record numbers of visitors eager to see the famous photograph. "We never expected this level of attention," Sarah admitted to Margaret as they watched crowds gather outside the museum's main entrance. "The twins love it," Margaret replied with a smile. "Thomas called this morning to say that he's been invited to speak at 3 universities this month." Indeed, Thomas and Elizabeth had become unlikely celebrities. At ages 87, they were traveling the country, sharing their story at conferences, universities, and research institutions. Their message was simple but profound. Love transcends death, and consciousness is more powerful than we ever imagined. Dr. Elena Vasquez had returned to MIT, where she was leading a new research program dedicated to studying consciousness and quantum mechanics. The funding for her research had increased dramatically following the publication of their findings. "We're receiving reports from around the world of similar phenomena," she told Sarah, during one of their regular video conferences. "Families are coming forward with their own photographs and experiences. We're building a database of consciousness-related anomalies that span centuries." Professor Hartley had established a new archive at Oxford dedicated to documenting historical instances of consciousness manifestation. "We're finding that these events are far more common than anyone realized," he reported. "They've just been dismissed or ignored by mainstream academia." Subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates on consciousness research and unexplained phenomena. The scientific community's response had been mixed but increasingly accepting. While some researchers remained skeptical, the quality of the evidence and the rigor of the investigation had convinced many others to take the findings seriously. Dr. Morrison had become something of a celebrity in photographic circles, developing new techniques for analyzing historical images for consciousness-related anomalies. "We're discovering that cameras have been capturing evidence of consciousness survival for over a century," he announced at a major photography conference. "We just didn't know how to recognize it, but perhaps the most significant impact of the discovery was on ordinary people around the world." The story of the Hartwell twins and their brother Michael had given hope to millions who had lost loved ones. Support groups formed online, sharing experiences and photographs that might contain evidence of continued consciousness. Sarah received hundreds of letters from people who had experienced similar phenomena. A woman in Japan wrote about photographs of her deceased husband appearing at their daughter's wedding. A man in Brazil shared images of his late mother seemingly present at family gatherings. A couple in Australia described sensing their stillborn child's presence during significant family moments. "We've opened a door," Sarah realized during one of the team's regular meetings. "We've given people permission to believe in experiences they've always had, but were afraid to share." Thomas and Elizabeth, now approaching their 88th birthdays, had become advocates for a new understanding of consciousness and death. They established the Michael Hartwell Foundation, dedicated to supporting research into consciousness survival and providing support to grieving families. "Michael would be so proud," Elizabeth said during the Foundation's inaugural event. "He always wanted to help people, even when he was alive. Now he's helping people understand that love never dies." The photograph itself had been carefully preserved and was now on permanent display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. A special exhibition, Windows Between Worlds, Evidence of Consciousness Beyond Death, had become the museum's most popular attraction. Visitors often reported unusual experiences while viewing the photograph. Some claimed to feel a sense of peace or comfort. Others described sensing the presence of their own deceased loved ones. The museum had installed a guest book where people could share their experiences, and it was filled with moving testimonials from around the world. Sarah often stood in the exhibition room, watching visitors react to the photograph. She had seen hardened skeptics break down in tears. Scientists questioned their fundamental assumptions about reality, and grieving families find comfort in the evidence that death was not the end. One afternoon, as Sarah was reviewing visitor comments, she noticed an elderly man standing alone in front of the photograph, tears streaming down his face. She approached him gently. "Are you all right, sir?" The man looked at her with eyes full of wonder. "My son died in Vietnam 50 years ago," he said quietly. "I've carried his picture with me every day since then, hoping for some sign that he was still somewhere. This photograph, it gives me hope that I might see him again." Sarah felt tears welling up in her own eyes. "I believe you will," she said softly. As the first anniversary of the discovery approached, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed. She had started as a museum curiosity studying historical photographs, but she had become something entirely different, a bridge between science and spirituality, between the known and the unknown. The twins, now 88, remained active and engaged, continuing to share their story with anyone who would listen. They had become living proof that consciousness could transcend physical limitations, that love was indeed stronger than death. "You know," Thomas said, during a recent visit to the museum, "Michael has been with us for 78 years, since he died. But it's only now, through this photograph, that the world can see him too." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes bright with joy. "We're not just twins anymore. We're triplets again, and everyone can see it." The photograph continued to yield new insights as technology advanced. Each new analysis revealed additional layers of information, suggesting that consciousness was far more complex and persistent than anyone had imagined. Vasquez's latest research indicated that the quantum signatures in the photograph were still active, still detectable after nearly 8 years. "It's as if the moment was frozen in time," she explained. The love and connection between the siblings created a permanent bridge between dimensions. As Sarah prepared for another day of interviews and research, she looked once more at the photograph that had changed everything. Thomas and Elizabeth smiled out at her from 1945, young and innocent, flanked by their beloved brother Michael, whose presence had finally been acknowledged by the world. The mystery of Times Square had been solved, but in solving it, they had opened the door to even greater mysteries. They had proven that consciousness survived death, that love transcended physical reality, and that the universe was far more magical than anyone had dared to imagine. And in a small research room in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, 3 children from 90s continued to smile, their bond unbroken by time, death, or the limitations of the physical world, a testament to the enduring power of love and the infinite nature of consciousness itself. Join our community of researchers and enthusiasts exploring the frontiers of consciousness and reality. Subscribe today for exclusive content and updates on groundbreaking discoveries. The photograph of the Hartwell twins and their brother Michael remains on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where it continues to inspire visitors from around the world. The twins, Thomas and Elizabeth, passed away peacefully within days of each other in 20. Visitors to the museum now reporting 3 children in the photograph, all equally clear and present. A family reunited at last.